Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. If you wouldn't mind keeping your microphones on mute, and that way we won't have any disruptions during the program today. I'm Renee Miller, the Program Manager at the Oregon Bioscience Incubator. And today we have Eric and Crystal from S2S, Public Relations and Communications. And before we get started, I'm just going to go ahead and give a brief bio background. Eric transforms complex subjects into compelling stories as a lifelong career. He's been a TV journalist covering hurricane search and rescue. He's met the Dalai Lama, and he's covered the White House and the president. He oversaw public relations and social media for geocaching.com, organically growing its social media audience from 5,000 to 500,000. He secures media placements for clients and has placed stories in the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Yahoo News, and other major news and life science publications. Eric is the founder and CEO of S2S, Public Relations and Communications. Crystal has built her career on the premise that clarity and authenticity builds trust, strengthens relationships, and fosters success. She's spent the past 15 years working with startups, nonprofits, and public sector organizations to build their brand through marketing, public relations, investor relations, public affairs, events, and internal communications. Her career spans TV news executive producer, VP of Marketing and Communications for Pacific Science Center, and most recently, she led new business vertical development and investor relations for a Seattle-based startup. Crystal is the COO of S2S, Public Relations and Communications. They're going to be our presenters today. If you have questions for them, please put them in the chat, and they'll answer some questions as we go along and other questions at the end. So, Eric and Crystal, are you ready?
I feel ready.
All right, you can go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
All right, sounds great. Now, I was reminded, Renee, as you were talking about muting people, how we used to talk about muting cell phones when we used to go to the movies. So that was a nice little familiar touch about days gone by. But we're excited to be with everyone today. Thank you for joining us. As Renee mentioned, feel free to add questions to the chat. We're excited to answer those questions. I'm a former TV news reporter, so I can tell almost any story in about 7 seconds. So I'll try to expand a little bit as we go through this. Crystal Clarity's joining us as well, and that is her last name. Schudiske, oddly, is Polish for clarity. So I think we have a lot in common. That's not true. That's not true. Okay, so we're going to start with the end in mind as we begin today. So what we want you to walk away with are these 6 items. You'll probably take 1 or 2 with you, and you'll get this deck at the end of the presentation, so you can comb through and use it as a resource. You also have our contact information. We're very open to quick email exchanges, quick calls. I'm very happy to add insight. We've been in the life science community in the Pacific Northwest for around 5 years now, helping brands shape their story. What we want you to walk away with after this presentation is why the right brand messages are so critical, and when the timing works for you, is most advantageous to you to refresh that messaging. Crystal's going to walk through a mini messaging diagnostic check. And then once you build messaging, the goal is, how can you produce content to leverage that messaging? How can you drive awareness against your new messaging? So we'll work on some content building blocks, and then also give you some resources and hopefully some inspiration along the way. So as Renee mentioned, S2S is a company that I founded about 5 years ago. It's not named after a droid. It's named after a seed to series, or series A to series B. So we really work in the venture funded space, and we, bisect that against the life science or complex technologies industry. You'll see our team here. We're all in the Pacific Northwest, and enjoy working with clients in our proximity. We typically stick to folks in along the Cascade corridor. So from Vancouver down to Portland, kind of our sweet spot. So why does it matter? And you've already reached this first milestone. What you work against is the speed of opinion. You get about 7 seconds. You've already, ideally, formed an opinion about how does the value of this presentation fit into your business and in your journey. So you're working against that, and how we typically gauge the speed of opinion. People, human beings in general, passed a horrible milestone about 2 years ago where our attention span is less than 7 seconds, which is less than a goldfish. So you are working against 7 seconds, and we say 7 words. So you get 7 words or less than 7 seconds to really help people frame whether the next 7 seconds or the next 7 words are worth their time. The musket mentality piece here, the why doesn't matter, is you tend to get one shot. People will form that opinion, and it's a long-standing opinion. It's tough to move them from that perspective. So that one shot really needs to matter. And something that's important for all of us probably to recognize is, if it's not you, it's someone else. If there's a void to be filled, you're not the only one. Your company ideally is not the only one that's going to attempt to fill that void. So make sure that you move quickly to help people form their opinion, and recognize that you have one shot. So we went through introductions pretty fast. Crystal, anything that you'd like to add in terms of framing before I get into the first part of this? And then Crystal will take us through kind of the middle section.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think we're going to throw a lot at you to consider, but as Eric mentioned, you guys will get a copy of the deck at the end. And certainly we're available after the presentation. If there's any questions as you sort of work through this process, we're happy to be a resource for you as well.
Okay. So Crystal, with that, the why does it matter, the framing up what people will take away, I'll hand it over to you to talk through the messaging and get under the hood.
Great. All right. So as I just mentioned, we've got a couple of exercises that we're going to take you through today. We're going to kind of do a high level pass on some of this stuff, with the idea being that if this is of interest to you and you find it to be valuable, that it's something that you can spend a little bit more time with after the fact. As you heard in my bio, from my background is primarily on the marketing and branding side, where Eric's leans a little bit more on the PR side. So done a lot of work with startups on helping them really evaluate their brand story, and then help them over time understand sort of how the story is going to evolve as the company evolves as well. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is some assessment tools to help you decide if it's a good time to maybe refresh or update your branding. And then we're going to take you through some strategies to make sure that once you do have your messaging in really good shape, that you're able to really amplify and leverage the content to your best and highest use. So when we talk about brand messaging, this is probably not new for most folks, but we're really talking about everything from what you write and what you say, whether it's to your internal audiences, so your team, your stakeholders, your investors. It's really everything that you say about your company, and how you convey the value of your company, your product, your team, and your mission. And it's such a critical piece for building those meaningful connections between your brands and your stakeholders. Next slide, Eric. Great. So, and really your brand messaging shows up in every communication. A lot of times I think people think of messaging as just maybe what's on your website. Obviously, that's a very important first door, but really it's also the way that you communicate with potential hires that you want to bring into your team, the media, your investors, your partners. It's really something that should be a common thread that matches across all of your different channels. And that's something to keep in mind as we go through this exercise today. So how do you know it's time for a refresh for you? I think this is important because a lot of times you think of like a Fortune 500 company needs to go through this exercise just as much as startups do. Because it's so important to make sure that the messaging that you are using to talk about your company is really meeting your needs. So when the message no longer drives the outcomes you're seeking, it's time for you to evaluate whether the messaging is time for a refresh. It could be anything from shift in your message, or shift in your mission, your vision. Maybe you've just raised some new money. And so maybe you're pivoting from being more investor focused to maybe getting ready to bring a product to market. All of those are really important times to consider updating your brand messaging. So if we were all in a room together at OBI, this is where we would ask for participation from the group. So, you can raise your hand. When's the last time you audited your messaging? probably been a while. So we're going to take you through some tips here to get you started, and hopefully this will be helpful for you. So some things to consider about where you're at as a company right now. Depending on when you created your messaging, or maybe you haven't even begun this process yet, but things to consider is, have there been changes in your product or your service offering? Has your target market or your audience changed? And I think the important thing to consider with this is that the market itself might still be the same, but the needs of that market might have changed. And the audience might be needing to hear different things from you or see different things from you. Your competitive landscape is something that as a company, you should be monitoring all of the time, and not only paying attention to what new products are they putting out into the market, how much money they've been raising, but also how are they changing their story? And have they changed their story in a way that now no longer differentiates you in the market? Or are they going after a potential angle that maybe you also are going after? Do you need to change the way you talk about yourself to differentiate yourself and make sure you're conveying the value that you provide to that space? And then how has your company changed? As I mentioned earlier, perhaps since you first created your website or your first messaging, maybe you've raised money, or maybe you're getting ready to go raise money. Maybe you're preparing yourself for your Series A, for example. Investors who are interested in Series A are going to be needing to hear and see different things from you than potential investors who maybe came in at seed stage, for example. So it's important, as you continue to look at how you evolve your messaging, that you look at what kind of stage is your company at. Are you looking to recruit talent? Those are all considerations with how your company maybe has changed. Maybe you've just brought in new leadership. That also would be a big change in your company and how you'd want to message yourself. And then I think the thing that we can't ignore, and I don't think anybody would, is the fact that the world looks very different right now. And if you developed your messaging and your branding over a year ago, it was with very different lens than the lenses that we're all wearing today. So as you consider, is it the right time for you to be, refreshing or updating your messaging? Keep it really in the context too of what the world looks like today. So we're going to take you through a mini messaging diagnostics exercise here, and we're going to present you with some checklists. And again, these are checklists that you can sort of, for the sake of our exercise today, just consider these sort of thought points. And then it might be something that you want to dig in a little bit more when you have some more time. These really break into 4 basic categories. The buckets are company and mission, offerings, audience and market, and competition. So as you go through and sort of evaluate your messaging, here are some things to consider. As it relates to your company and mission, how has your mission evolved? Has it? And maybe it hasn't too much, but pay attention and see, has your mission changed since you first developed your messaging? And is your vision still aligned with your company's trajectory? And a lot of times we see changes in this with startups. So this is a big one to really pay attention to. And then, as I mentioned earlier, have there been changes in your leadership team, your advisors, or your board? Your advisors and your board members are huge assets for your organization. And depending on sort of their connections in the community and their leadership and their reputation, they can be assets that perhaps you're not leveraging maybe as much as you could when it comes to thinking about your messaging and how you frame yourself. The next one is your product or service offerings. Just asking yourself, has your offerings relevance changed? And again, in that context of how the world's changed in the last year, there's a good chance for many of you that it has, potentially and hopefully for the better. Does your offerings core value propositions have the same meaning and importance in the pandemic world? And are there aspects that are more of value today than when you first built out your messaging? And are you constantly taking in the feedback you're getting from your customers, your users, your investors about whether or not the positioning and messaging that you're working is effective and resonating with them in a way that is driving the kind of action and business objectives that you're hoping for? The next category that we really look at is audience and market fit. So again, are there changes to your target market? And I don't mean to keep kind of hammering this message, but the fact is in the last year, so much has changed that it's very likely there have been changes in your target market. Have their needs changed? And also, what kind of traction have you seen with your existing messaging? I think this is one that most people are sort of guilty of not spending enough time with. So you're putting messaging out there, but what kind of traction are you actually getting? Are you asking the right questions to find out if that messaging is resonating with the audiences that you're trying to engage with? Have you broken into, or you plan to break into new markets? And this is where I think it really gets into opportunity. Are there opportunities that maybe you can seize on that you haven't yet? And does your messaging need to change to adjust to that as well? And then are there changes to your product market fit? And again, this is, I think, when you look at competition, which is the last bucket we're going to talk about, this is an important one too, is sort of what does that market look like? How has it changed since you first entered into the scene? Or perhaps you haven't even, maybe you're still, pre-product, maybe you haven't even brought anything to market yet. But as you continue to think about getting ready for that next phase, what else does the landscape look like? And what do you need to take into consideration with your messaging to make sure that you're breaking through? The space, depending on what space you're in, there's a good chance it has become more crowded over the years. And is there anything else that you need to be doing to break through with your messaging to really make sure you're differentiating and continually checking yourself to make sure that your existing messaging does stand out? And then again, the last thing I would just kind of put a bow on this is continuing to make sure that you are looking for opportunities to adapt for the new normal. And I think this goes back to everything from looking for opportunities to also just being really empathetic as business leaders and as founders to recognize that the audiences that we're all looking to impact change with and to connect with are also living in this different world with us right now. And looking for those opportunities to sort of help frame your value proposition in a context that really shows that you understand and that you can provide solutions in this sort of the new world that we live in is going to be an opportunity, I think, as well. Okay, so then this is the next exercise. And this is, I apologize if this is difficult to read. You will get a copy of this, so keep that in mind as well. We call this internally the core brand attribute matrix. And this is part of S2SPR's larger brand messaging platform that we create for clients. And we think this is probably the most important piece of that. And the idea here is for you to really think critically about what are the unique attributes of your brand that differentiate you from others in your space. We typically recommend you come up with 3 to 5 of these. In this example, we have 4 attributes on the top. We only have 3 proof points on the side. You'll see we're missing a number 2 because this is one of a client's and we wanted to keep it anonymous. So we removed proof point 2 and redacted some other content. But the idea here is, in this example, this is a medical device company that's building a new medical device. And we've identified 4 themes that we think do the best job of helping to differentiate this company from others that are also developing similar or have developed similar medical devices to this startup. And so for each of those, we have a theme. The first theme is that fills a critical unmet need. The second theme is it's a pioneering technology. The third is that they have early traction and validation. This company has already had research published, and they've also raised pretty significant money. And they have a team that has really extensive, diverse leadership in the different areas that like an investor would be most excited about. So we kind of identified those as the 4 buckets. And then for each, we've developed a core brand attribute, which is a statement. And the example you see is under core brand attribute 1. And then for each of those, and this is really important, you want to make sure you have 3 or 4 statements that prove that that's true. So again, going back to the example of early traction validation, their 3rd core brand attribute, the proof points there, one of them, for example, would be they've already had 7 research papers, peer-reviewed research papers published. Another example might be they've already finished an observational trial. So that's sort of an example. The idea being here is now you have these statements and this content that you can start to build out the larger narrative around your company in a way that really does differentiate you and helps make sure that you have these messages that can be repurposed across all your different channels and do a really good job of reinforcing the larger value of your organization. Okay, so now what? So I kind of threw a lot at you. It's a lot to think about. Hopefully there's enough information in those slides that you feel like you can kind of work through this activity yourself. And I'm going to hand it back to Eric now, who's going to talk about what you do once you have refreshed your messaging.
Mm-hmm. That's such a heavy lift to get to the point where we are now, to build an actionable playbook that you can pull bits and pieces of content from that meet all the criteria that that Crystal outlined. Does it differentiate your technology against other technology in your competitive space? Does it lean into the value that you add, the ecosystem and the unique value that your technology will offer your space? So a lot of heavy lifting at that point, but you don't want to stop there, of course. You want to apply this in many different ways. You want to look at what can I do that will have the greatest impact with the lightest amount of lift. And there's quite a bit there. So what we suggest is, as you're looking at building out content based on this, so imagine you have your matrix, you've done your homework. You have your matrix, you understand what differentiates you from the competition, how you're unique, the value that you add, your ecosystem. Some of the ways that we help articulate that on not just websites, but also in media releases, engaging with media stakeholders, partners, potential investors, is to find the right words. Some of the quick tips that I can give you there that's interesting, there's a resource slide right after this, is oftentimes we'll pull websites, entire copy from competitors' websites, we'll just put them on word clouds. What words are most relevant to them, which are the most important, which do they use most frequently? And there's free tools to make that happen. Then you want to see trend lines. Are these words, articulating a value that is on the rise, or is a trend that's decreasing? So a great goal, I'll say it as a goal, is to add through subtraction. You're going to produce quite a bit of copy, especially on your first run as you're trying to develop some copy against these messaging pieces. So reduce copy by about 25%. We'll always go in and we'll look where we can do some nips and tucks with copy, because as we address at the beginning of our presentation, you get about 7 words before you earn the next 7. And to think about it in that capacity, you have to earn every moment that you have with an audience member, and that audience member could be an investor, it could be a potential partner. So you want to be very diligent in finding the right words that articulate your value. And then not just articulate your value, but you want to drive people to action. What do you want people who are landing on a website, consuming a press release, looking at your social feed, what do you want them to do? What's the direction you want to drive them in? Is it to reach out through a contact form? And we'll get to, if you like home improvement shows like the before and after, the horrible kitchen and then the new kitchen, you're going to like a few slides that are coming up because we have before and after for websites that we've worked on. But they're all driven to help people find a path that relates to a goal for the company. So you'll see that in form. But if you look at this slide, finding the right words is a task, something you have to struggle at, strive at, and then reducing copy, and then what do you want them to do once they consume that message? Here's some resources, and when you receive this slide deck, each of these is clickable. So, there are places where you can test some of your theories. So many people in our audience today are scientists. So how do you make sure that your trend line is moving? So Google Trends is there. You can search not just Taylor Swift or Kim Kardashian, but relevant trends to you. How do those align? Some examples. You can look at, where are people in terms of COVID vaccinations? Where's the trend line there? Are you playing in the COVID space in terms of your innovation? Where are you seeing opportunities? Wordifier is a great tool that we use. I put innovative in there. You notice that it flagged a caution. Words have a certain degree of meaning at the beginning of their lifespan, and then that fades and diffuses. The example that I often use here is, if you'll remember in the maybe 80s or 90s, gold cards were the best you could possibly get if you had a credit card. If you had a gold card, you could buy anything. And now gold cards are essentially meaningless. You have to need a triple diamond card or a platinum card. So there is an evolution to language and the value that we associate with certain words, and innovative just doesn't mean anything anymore. So if that's a word that you're resting a lot of weight on, to consider how you might be able to couch that in a way. And this tool, gives you some synonyms to consider, some related words to consider to help you add value to that word. And the final piece here, you'll see innovative and new normal. This is the URL there is muckrack.com/trends. you can just look at who's publishing on what, how many articles are being published on certain topics. You can get really detailed into what you're sourcing. So you want to see, we do some work in future of work, the new normal, and we see that that term, future of work, is on the decline in terms of articles related to it. So now we need to define, what is that piece in future of work that's related to the client that I'm speaking to. So here's our home improvement show. So this is a site that we worked on a couple of years ago. So if you look at this site and you think they nailed it, this is one that needed some love and attention that we worked on. And I'm going to draw your attention to the top hand navigation. Sometimes people get so inside their own technology that it's difficult for them to just step back a little bit and recognize what they're actually saying. So if your second tab is about no, you might want to just step back and think, does everyone read that as about nitric oxide? And the answer is no, they don't. They just view it as the word no. And if you're looking at investment, putting no up on the top might not be the best and most significant path to realizing that investment. So what we want to do is work with this client to unpack some of the value. And after producing the core brand attributes, we produced a website for them and then drove media against it, and then tried to crystallize the value of their technology. It wasn't just in nitric oxide, which is a pretty interesting molecule if you're not familiar. And actually, the person who did the leading research in it won a small prize called the Pulitzer for this, I believe, in '97. So the nitric oxide is a very interesting molecule. It has a lot of potential, but educating an investor, a potential partner on that is important. And this is really focused. You'll see that last tab is now investors, really focused towards engaging investors in their product. So that's one where we built out the core brand messaging. And then this tagline wasn't in the core brand messaging, but it was a product of that. So this next one is one we did most recently. So, maybe slightly better. You see some testimonials across the bottom, but there's quite a bit happening on this homepage. We really want to drive action. So this is what we worked with the client on, and this becomes a video. So if you go to optisite.com, you'll see the video play, and I encourage you to explore that website because it's a very interesting integration of very engaging animations, but also, we also are very targeted towards investors here as well. And there's one piece in particular that I want to draw your attention to. So part of the value of this technology is in the oximetry space. So the legacy technology that it's trying to dethrone is a pulse oximeter. So that's the thing that goes on the tip of your finger if you go to the hospital. The pulse oximeter, notoriously enough, doesn't do well with all pigment types, which is a tragedy unto itself. But the technology that we're working with here, has accounted for that. So we work with several different teams while producing websites. While working with one team, here's the product itself. We asked for a rendering. The first hand that came back was a Caucasian hand, which we didn't believe represented the encompassing value of the company. So we pushed back and received a hand that clearly has much more pigmentation and more representative of the value that this technology offers. So when you look at this confluence of not just words, but images and driving people in a direction, the goal that you saw from this site is really right there is in the contact us, drive people through to engage in partnerships, to engage in investment, and showing the value proposition early on in this. So let's see. So you have your website, you've produced that, but the website you have to imagine is a passive asset. It's difficult for people to find it. You're going to get some SEO, and that's baked into the process of producing a website. But you also want to not just be passive, but engage in outreach to drive people back to the website. So a few ways, just doing a quick time check. A few ways that you can do that is producing short thought pieces. Now imagine the core brand attributes. you already have 4 or 5 pillars of what differentiates you or adds value to your technology. Each of those you could produce into a short thought piece. And we really think short as in 200 to 300 words. And as a CEO of a company or a CSO of a company, this is a great way for you to articulate your vision for how you add value. So this is the articulate the why this matters. We often produce CEO why statements, and the one on optusite.com is, I think, particularly relevant. Why your technology matters. And this has so many benefits as you're building out your team. This allows some discoverability into your vision as a CEO. And now that you've ideally gone through this exercise, stood up some of the value that helps define your company and your vision, these pieces become a little bit easier, but you want to showcase and drive some searchability around your why statement, why this company matters, the difference it's going to make, the impact that it's going to have, not just on the technology landscape, but also the patient landscape, as we're in the life science space most often. So the CEO why statement we find is very valuable as you're building out your team. So how do you maximize the exposure? We're using a hub and spoke. The hub for your value is your website, but you're going to engage your social media properties and drive this new branding that you've invested no small amount of time into. Drive people back to learn more about your technology. And then ideally, because we've worked and thought about what action do we want people to take, you're engaging people in kind of contacting with you, investing in you, starting a conversation with you, exploring partnerships with you. So some quick ways to make sure that that's relevant is, of course, social media. But one of my favorites is just adding a hyperlink on your signature about viewing your latest thought piece, because the most common interaction a CEO or a founder will have with the landscape will be emails. So why not add that piece and get some credit and drive people to something that differentiates you. View our latest thought piece is a little generic, so you could spice that up, make it a little more tangible, have a little bit more granularity to it. And then some of the best people in the business have great networks, so engage your network in engaging with your content. We had, when we launched the OptusSite website, I think they had 64 LinkedIn followers, and their post about funding, they got picked up in some media. Their post about funding had around 9,000 impressions, which is a very difficult push unless you engage your friendlies to amplify that content. So that was a powerful exercise. So what are the best outcomes? You're doing all this, you're struggling so hard to find the right messaging. You want to raise your visibility and your value, not just in your technology, but we always talk to CEOs about having not one, and one is often enough, not one product, but two. You not just have your company, but you also have yourself as a thought leader, because your company will spin out, but we want to make sure that you're driving some of the equity into your profile. So as you rebrand, that's going to become part of your DNA as well. We want to make sure that you can speak that language and you can capture some of that value. So as you're building out your team, this increases the recruiting pool by increasing your awareness, increases your potential exposure to investments, and drives SEO. And we like to make sure that you're happy. So it ends with happiness. That you're able to reach the goals that you want to drive. Crystal, before we get to our thank yous, any addendums or additional thoughts that you have as I comb through this?
No, I don't think so. I think I'll just quickly mention one other, as we were speaking of maximizing exposure of your content. One other technique that is really, really effective for generating more visibility for your company and you as a thought leader is it's called newsjacking. And it's just the idea of when there's relevant news happening that has something to do with potentially the technology or the market that you're playing in. For you as a thought leader, just to quickly comment, typically this would happen if there was a news article online, you would comment in the comment section or a tweet or something like that, that you would have a relevant kind of fresh take on. The big opportunity there is that journalists are always looking for fresh takes and thought leaders who they haven't spoken to yet, who might have a unique perspective, or be able to take a story to sort of a new level that hasn't been covered yet. And that's a huge opportunity that we've seen that could be very, very effective. And once you've built out your core brand attribute document, you suddenly have 4 buckets of content now that would work really, really well for doing that.
Mm-hmm. And you can absolutely front load that as well. You know, you're the subject matter expert in your field. You understand what themes are recurring themes and how you can add value to those conversations. So to pre-produce blog posts and social media posts and just sit and wait. And then when that comes up, you're first on the draw to engage with that content is another technique that we use. So, you know, as we round out our conversation, hopefully we offered you some thoughts on branding, language, how to add value to your technology. You can see that we're available there. You have our email addresses, and that's our Twitter handle at S2SPRcomms. So feel free to engage us there. And with that, Renee, you know, we're open to questions or additional comments.
Thank you, Eric and Crystal. That was really great. Tons of helpful information and also the reasons behind it. Sometimes we go through the motions with branding and not really sure what we do, but to go back to the reason why, why is your company in existence? What are you trying to convey? And follow these guys on Twitter. They post a lot of really interesting stuff. So if you follow them on Twitter, then you'll be able to get their information all the time. So thank you so much for leading this discussion today. If you have questions for them, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Then you can open up your microphone and ask the questions. And while I'm waiting for questions, I'm going to put up a quick poll, post-program survey that I would appreciate if you would fill out, please. And I'll just leave that up on the screen. Hopefully you can see it. Leave that up there for a couple of minutes while we're waiting for questions from people. Great presentation, just chock full of information.
Yeah, and as we wait, you heard that my background's in journalism, so I can definitely fill time as we wait for questions. I think one of the most often asked questions, so might front load this, is the time commitment that is needed for one of these exercises. And we really see it as a matter of and Crystal, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's something that you can burn through in about 4 weeks in terms of working on a very thoughtful and diligent process. So to think about, if it's February now, in mid-March, you could have some new messaging that you could unveil in times, to triangulate that against. Definitely, as you're thinking about hiring, bringing on partners, investment, is a great time to give it a couple of weeks to saturate before executing against a potential raise or potential news, to make sure that people are seeing the most relevant and timely information on you. And websites ideally are easy enough that you can get in and you can rewrite headlines and rewrite some copy, so the lift shouldn't be too difficult, we hope.
Great. Okay, I'm going to close the polling in just a few more seconds. So if you haven't filled it out yet, please do so. We've got some questions. I'm going to turn off the polling. Great, thank you. So we've got a question from Hazel. Hazel, if you want to go ahead and open up your mic. She asks, the SEO game can be frustrating for founders without a marketing or PR staff. So how would you help a startup who doesn't understand the inner workings of SEO? Mm-hmm. And tell everybody what SEO means.
Yeah, that's great. Crystal, did you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah. So SEO is search engine optimization, for people who aren't familiar with it. I think that it can be really, really overwhelming, for sure. And we, full transparency, we aren't an SEO shop in the sense that we don't do, we don't go heavy on SEO. We certainly don't do paid SEO. But I think the important thing to understand about SEO is that sort of like increasing visibility or discoverability of your content, right? So you optimize SEO in order to make it easier for people to find you. So when somebody Googles your company, it's great if you come up on the first page for search rankings, right? So I think that's just sort of high level, that's SEO. Companies can spend tens of thousands of dollars on SEO. We do not recommend that for the companies that we work with, especially when you're first getting started. But there are a lot of things that you can do as a smaller company or a startup to increase your SEO rankings. A couple things to keep in mind is going through that branding exercise is actually really, really important, because you start to identify the words and the value that is most important to the audience that you're trying to reach. So when they're searching, they're more likely to find you because the words that they're using to search for are the words that align with what you're talking about. So that's one thing that's really, really important about why you want to make sure your brand messaging is hitting the right audiences, is making sure that those words are going to be more discoverable. Eric, do you want to mention a couple? You've done more SEO than I have, and I have a couple other tips at the end if you don't mention them.
Yeah. And I can talk about standing on the shoulders of really large marketing budgets. You have a competitive landscape. So finding competitors in your space that are kind of the titans, taking their messaging, word clouding it, and then pulling out some of those big words that you see that are relevant to them. Those words are well researched on their end, so they're vetted in some capacity. So applying those words into your messaging will at least put you on some equal or more equal footing with those competitors. Another big driver for SEO is publication. So you want to make sure, and this is where publishing blog posts and even those micro posts are really important. So search engines will look not just at content, but also, so many websites just become fallow. I grew up in a farming community, just become untended. So they're no longer relevant. So relevancy is really important in search rankings. So to make sure that you're publishing to your site on a fairly periodic, if not frequent basis. So these micro blog posts, adding testimonials, adding content, updating content will all increase your search engine optimization. So I definitely, Hazel, agree that it can be frustrating, because it's also then an exercise of how many people are going to your website. And you can control that. There are knobs and dials. More social, driving people back to your website is important. So having content there will help with SEO. So, short answer, politely steal some of the search engine optimization that your competitors have already generated through their words, and then make sure that you're publishing frequently and have a strong sense of where you fall and the value you add and the terminology around that.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Maya has a question. She says, so many neat tools. Thank you. If you had to force rank the order of work, what would you recommend to start with? What's first, second, or third?
Crystal comes.
Want me to go?
Yeah, Crystal comes first in our world.
Yeah. So the way that I would recommend beginning this process is first really making sure that you are clear on who your target audiences are, and making sure that you prioritize those audiences when you're thinking through what your story is going to be. So depending on what stage you are, what you're looking to do as a company, it could be investors might be your number one audience, or potentially partners. You might be at a stage of your company where you have a product that you're ready to sell into the market. So maybe customers are your number one. So making sure that you prioritize first, and keep in mind that you can't be everything to everybody, lest you'll be nothing to everyone. So you have to make sure, like, the messaging for an investor isn't necessarily going to be exactly the same as the message for the customer. In fact, it probably won't be. So making sure that you prioritize who your audiences are right now, what you're hoping, what you want your audiences to do as a result of interacting with you and your content. And I think once you do that first, then it becomes a little bit easier to work into some of those other pieces. So I think that audience identification and prioritization is first. Understanding and thinking through what are their unique needs and perceptions that we need to make sure we're addressing. What do they need to hear from us to be able to do what we need them to do? Is sort of the first piece before you get into that core brand attribute, sort of that matrix that I showed you. I think once you have a good handle on your audiences and their unique needs and challenges, then it's easier to kind of look at yourself and kind of take a microscope and say, okay, this is what we do that aligns and will resonate with what they need to see and hear from us, that also separates us from our competition. I would put that piece in there too. You do the audience work, and then you also want to do a competitive analysis of sort of who else is in this space, what are they seeing, how do we differentiate from them, kind of that sort of that piece of the landscape analysis, and then building out the core brand attributes piece next, I would say, would be sort of the order of operations, I would say. And once you have all of that done, it becomes a little bit easier to step back and then develop the rest of the messaging. And I think Eric mentioned this a couple minutes ago. It's also important to make sure that you are really talking to and listening to your stakeholders. So as you're developing these messages, find somebody that you can bounce them off of, whether it's investors or advisors or board members or, you know, your cat or whatever, but just make sure that you're not doing this in a vacuum. I think that's really important as well.
And there's something to be said too about enrolling your influencers into the process of messaging. There's very few people who fail to form an opinion around a tagline. You know, to engage someone in what do you think of these 3 taglines is an easy way if you're trying to engage with potential partners, your cap table, you know, all these potential people that play a big role in your life. Bring them into the process when the timing suits you best. Now, I will note that one of the biggest frustrations on the media side of this equation is when you drive a significant amount of media to a website that doesn't do its job, right? So imagine that before and after split. If we and we've done this, you know, place people in Wall Street Journal or Modern Healthcare, and then a flood of people come to a website and just dissolve, right? So the website really has to be first, and we often have that as a prerequisite to media because you want to capture all that attention because you do get one shot, and you know we want people to recognize your value as soon as they hit your website.
And I think the one thing I would add to that is I got a direct message question from Liz that I think builds onto that, and it was around that idea of it's frustrating to go to websites that have a bunch of catchy phrases, but you don't really understand what they do or what's the point. And she asked if we have any sort of suggestions for that. And I think kind of building, Eric, on what you said, you know, it's different when you're, say, a Nike and people know who your brand is and you can get away with just saying, just do it. It doesn't, you know, your startup technology company, just do it doesn't tell you anything and it doesn't mean anything. So I think when we counsel, you know, our startup clients, we tend to focus when it comes to things like taglines and content on your homepage to really around conveying impact. And if you can get people to understand the impact of your technology first, then you can get them to sort of unpack the rest of it. And I think the ideal scenario with the website is, okay, so you can convey the impact. There's enough content on there that gives them a little bit of a sense of how you do what you do, but then it's an open door that invites them to engage on a deeper level. So if they're interested in learning more, to always make sure there's lots of opportunities throughout their website. If this is exciting to them, here's how you can contact us to kind of get to that next layer of information. So Liz, hopefully that answers your question. I'm happy to, if you want to send me a separate message, I'm happy to help you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Speaking of what you mentioned before involving customers, Ginger asked, when and how do you involve customers or the public, like thinking of a focus group in terms of maybe, you know, like she referenced the before and afters on that website.
Krista, do you want to talk about focus groups, customers, and rolling a larger census in messaging?
Yeah, so, you know, I think that it's the more that you feel comfortable being transparent with your community, I think the better. And I think your community is going to respond more favorably. I think that that's continuing to trend more and more in that direction too over time. So, you know, I think feeling like it's okay to be a little bit vulnerable and sharing with your customers where you're at and getting feedback from them, I think is something that they'll appreciate the opportunity to provide feedback. I think focus groups is certainly one of many options for how that can be done. I think that if crafted well, I think surveys can work really well, or just, you know, scheduling, you know, phone calls with people. I think the challenge with all of that is even with focus groups, I'm sure people like, there's a little bit of the sort of confirmation bias issue that you have to just account for when you're going through that process of getting feedback. And so I think just being as trying to approach it as much as possible from a perspective of, all constructive feedback is helpful, and trying to set it up in a way that you're asking the questions that are as open-ended as possible is, or specific, but done in a way that doesn't lead them toward one answer or the other, I think is another thing to consider. So I think certainly focus groups is one of many options, but we've seen a lot of brands that have leveraged their social media and LinkedIn and, invited people to come inside and see what they've done, and invited feedback on that process. Eric,
Yeah.
anything else?
Yeah, I'd just add to, think about the audience that you're trying to reach. And Crystal talked about this. So say it's investors. You want to make sure that you're speaking to that audience, but it's also not an echo chamber when you engage with them. And I go back to that before picture in the about no. That like to everyone who saw that made so much sense, probably investors included. So to make sure you don't have an about no moment where there is just this echo chamber of ideas to think about, all right, here's a census of people that we already have influence with, but to go a little bit beyond that into a second tier of individuals will offer a fresh perspective and maybe ping you with some ideas that you hadn't considered previously about assumptions you have around messaging.
Great, thank you. Greg asked if you have any favorite books or other sources of content that you recommend that cover communication strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the one book that I think is valuable in this space and is a fairly quick read is by Alan Alda, who is an actor, but he also has a foundation that talks about science communication. And the title of the book is something along the lines of would I have this expression if I knew what you're talking about? So I'll make sure that Renee has a URL about it, but it talks about some exercises you can use to make sure that you're being as diligent as you can about focusing on the audience and explaining in a way. And he really wrote this book for scientists who are trying to convey to policymakers or investors the value of their technology. So it's very apropos in this space.
And I'll mention quickly, this is a book that's sort of always on my desk. It's called The New Rules of Marketing and PR. This is the 7th edition. It's always a bestseller. What's great about it is it's very digestible, small nuggets on many different aspects of PR and marketing, but there's a lot of great takeaways, and it's not a book you need to sit down and read front to back. But this is another one I would recommend as well.
Nice product placement, Crystal.
You like that? It just happened to be.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking for my copy. All this.
Very nice. Emmanuel asked if you could provide more information on the suite of services you provide and costs. So I'm wondering if they would find that through your website, or if you have any information that I could send out to our registrants.
Yeah, I thank you for asking that question. I think there's a little bit of mystery around, what does this cost and the value that you receive out of it. So always very happy to talk money, but also value. And when you're in this space, you have about 3 options. You have a solopreneur, someone who just does this as a one-person shop. You have small boutique firms like ours, and then you have mid or large size firms, and the price point's going to vary from sub 5,000 north for the first group, probably north of 5,000 for our class of operators, and then north of 15,000 for large groups. So you kind of have these 3 buckets in terms of potential price tags, and of course it varies. And our suite of services, we're pretty focused on providing awareness to impact technologies and everything that includes. So from everything from Crystal's scope of work, which is branding and messaging and marketing, into public relations, social media, thought leadership, profile building. So we kind of run that gambit. And as someone who worked in a deadline focused industry for most of his career, we want to drive you to your finish line. We don't want these, I don't want these perpetual relationships that we're just maintaining, but we're in strong growth markets, and we want to make sure that we're always accelerating and increasing awareness for our client base. So that's fun. And then usually the finish line is is closing around or reaching an acquisition state. Crystal, what else would you add to that? And what might you subtract that I've already said?
I won't subtract anything. No, I think that's great. I think that gives sort of a high level idea of how sort of PR agencies work with startups in this space. And if they're specifically interested in what we have, obviously we've got our contact information in our website. So.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, the two of you. You did a fabulous job today. It was really informative. I think everybody got a lot out of it. And I appreciate everyone for attending. I will be sending out a recording tomorrow and the slide deck with it. And so you'll have their contact information. If you want to reach out to them, feel free to do so. And again, I appreciate you supporting the Oregon Bioscience Incubator and everyone for coming. And I hope you all have a fabulous week.
And thank you, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thanks. Take care. If it snows, be safe.
Yeah. Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.